Imagine waking up one morning and discovering that overnight, someone had built an entire city. Not a small town, not a suburb, a full, functioning, massive city with roads, buildings, factories, hospitals, and hundreds of thousands of people living and working inside it. Now imagine doing that not once, but hundreds of times in the span of just 4 years. That is the closest comparison I can give you to what the United States of America did between 1941 and 1945. And most people alive today have absolutely no idea it happened. We talk about American power. We talk about American industry. We throw around phrases like the arsenal of democracy and the greatest generation. But those words have become so familiar, so worn smooth by repetition, that they've lost their edges. They no longer cut. They no longer shock. And what happened to the United States Navy between December 7th, 1941 and September 2nd, 1945 absolutely should shock you. It should stop you cold. It should make you put down whatever you're doing and say, wait, that's not possible. That cannot be real. But it is real. Every number I'm going to give you tonight is documented. Every ship is in the historical record. Every factory, every worker, every rivet, every weld, it all happened. And by the time this story is over, you're going to understand something about human potential, about industrial will, about what a nation can do when it decides, truly decides, that failure is not an option. On December 7th, 1941, the United States Navy had roughly 790 ships in active service. That number includes everything: battleships, cruisers, destroyers, submarines, auxiliaries. 790 ships. It sounds like a lot until you realize that in that same moment, the Imperial Japanese Navy was one of the most powerful fighting forces on the face of the earth. And the German Navy, the Kriegsmarine, was strangling Atlantic supply lines with a submarine campaign so effective that Britain, the island nation that had ruled the seas for 3 centuries, was on the edge of starvation. The United States, despite being the largest economy on Earth, was not ready for what was coming. And then Pearl Harbor happened. In the space of 2 hours on a quiet Sunday morning in Hawaii, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor didn't just kill 2,403 Americans. It didn't just sink battleships and destroy aircraft. It detonated something inside the American psyche that had never been fully ignited before. It unleashed a fury of purpose, a collective national will, that the world had never seen and has never seen since. And within days, the United States government, American industry, and the American worker began the most extraordinary transformation of military power in the entire history of human civilization. Let me give you a number that I want you to hold in your mind for the rest of this story. By September of 1945, the United States Navy had grown from 790 ships to approximately 6,800 ships. Read that again. From 790 to 6,800 in 4 years. In the time it takes a child to go from kindergarten to 4th grade, the United States built the largest naval force in the history of the world, not by a small margin, not by doubling or tripling its fleet, but by multiplying it nearly 9 times over. 9 times. That is not a statistic. That is a miracle of industrial civilization. But before we get deep into the numbers, I want you to understand the world that existed before all of this. Because to truly appreciate what America built, you have to understand what America was. And what America was, in 1939 and 1940, was a country that had been gutted by a decade of economic depression, a country that was profoundly, almost religiously opposed to getting involved in another European war, and a country whose military was, by the standards of the major global powers, embarrassingly small. In 1939, the United States Army ranked 17th in the world in terms of size and readiness. 17th. Behind Romania. Behind Portugal. The American military was so underfunded, so neglected, that soldiers were training with wooden rifles because there weren't enough real ones to go around. Artillery units were using trucks with signs that said "Cannon" painted on the side. The military of the most economically powerful nation on earth was, in many respects, a paper tiger. And the Navy, while in better shape than the Army, was still stretched dangerously thin across two massive oceans with a force that had been built in the 1920s and early 1930s. Ships that were aging, in some cases outdated, and nowhere near sufficient for a two-ocean war. The man who understood this better than anyone was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And here is where the story gets genuinely fascinating, because Roosevelt had been thinking about naval power his entire adult life. He had served as Assistant Secretary of the Navy during World War I. He understood ships the way other politicians understood speeches. He knew tonnage and displacement, and gun calibers the way a musician knows scales. And as early as 1938, as Hitler was tearing up the map of Europe and Japan was brutalizing China, Roosevelt was already pushing Congress for naval expansion funds. He saw what was coming. He could feel it in his bones. The Vincent-Trammell Act of 1934 had already authorized a modest expansion of the fleet. But it was the Naval Expansion Act of 1938, and then the Two-Ocean Navy Act of 1940, that truly set the stage for what was to come. The Two-Ocean Navy Act alone, signed into law on July 19, 1940, more than a year before Pearl Harbor, authorized the construction of 257 new warships and 15,000 new aircraft. The price tag was $4 billion. In 1940 money, that's the equivalent of something approaching $80 or $90 billion today. And Congress passed it. The isolationists grumbled, but they passed it. Because even the most determined opponents of American involvement in foreign wars could look at what was happening in Europe and see that the world was changing in ways that could not be ignored. But all of that, the acts, the authorizations, the appropriations, all of that was just paper. It was ambition written in ink. The real story of the American naval buildup is not a story of legislation. It is a story of steel and fire and human sweat. It is a story of shipyards that worked around the clock, 365 days a year, in rain and snow and blazing summer heat. It is a story of women who had never held a welding torch in their lives becoming master welders in a matter of weeks. It is a story of production techniques so radical, so revolutionary, that they permanently changed the way the entire world thinks about manufacturing. And it is a story of ordinary Americans, farmers and factory workers and teachers and mechanics, who showed up, rolled up their sleeves, and built a navy that crushed two of the most powerful military forces in human history. So let's start at the beginning. Let's start on that terrible Sunday morning in December of 1941. And let's walk through this story step by step, year by year, ship by ship. Because every step of this journey is astonishing. Every chapter contains moments that will make your jaw drop. And by the end, you will understand something about what human beings are capable of when they are truly, absolutely, completely motivated. December 7th, 1941. The attack on Pearl Harbor begins at 7:55 in the morning, Hawaiian time. Japanese aircraft, 353 of them, launched from 6 carriers, sweep in over the mountains of Oahu and begin their devastating work. The battleship Arizona explodes when a bomb penetrates her forward magazine, killing 1,177 of her crew in an instant. The Oklahoma capsizes. The West Virginia and California are sunk at their moorings. The Nevada manages to get underway and is deliberately beached to prevent her from blocking the harbor channel. In less than 2 hours, the United States Pacific Fleet's battleship force has been effectively destroyed. But here's what the Japanese did not do. They did not hit the American aircraft carriers. The Enterprise, the Lexington, and the Saratoga were all away from Pearl Harbor on December 7th. They did not hit the submarine base. They did not hit the massive fuel oil storage tanks, 4.5 million barrels of oil sitting in tank farms above Pearl Harbor. And critically, they did not finish the job. Admiral Nagumo, commanding the Japanese strike force, decided against launching a third wave of attacks. He turned his carriers around and sailed for home. It was, as Admiral Yamamoto himself later acknowledged, a mistake that helped doom Japan. Because the carriers survived, the submarines survived, the fuel survived, And the most powerful industrial economy on Earth was now fully, totally, irreversibly at war. The day after Pearl Harbor, Congress declared war on Japan. 3 days later, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States, and Congress responded in kind. And on that day, December 11th, 1941, the machinery that would produce 6,800 ships began to grind into motion. The first thing you have to understand about American shipbuilding in 1941 is the landscape it was operating in. The United States had a number of established naval shipyards, government-owned facilities like the Philadelphia Navy Yard, the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard in New Hampshire, the Puget Sound Naval Shipyard in Washington State, the Norfolk Naval Shipyard in Virginia. These were old, experienced facilities that had been building warships for decades. But they were not enough. Not remotely enough. The government knew this. The Navy knew this. And so even before Pearl Harbor, the process of expanding American shipbuilding capacity had begun. Private shipyards up and down both coasts were being contracted, expanded, and in some cases built from scratch. The Bethlehem Steel Company, the Newport News Shipbuilding Company, the Bath Iron Works in Maine, all of them were gearing up for a production surge unlike anything they had ever attempted. And then came the brilliant, radical, world-changing idea that would make everything possible. The idea of prefabrication. And the man most associated with that idea, though he was building cargo ships rather than warships, was a contractor named Henry Kaiser. Henry Kaiser was not a shipbuilder by training. He was a construction man. He had built roads and dams, including the Hoover Dam and the Grand Coulee Dam. He thought about large construction projects the way an engineer thinks about assembly problems. How do you break this down into manageable pieces? How do you move those pieces into position as efficiently as possible? And how do you put them together in the shortest possible time? When he applied that thinking to shipbuilding, the results were revolutionary. Before Kaiser, ships were built the way ships had always been built, from the keel up, in a single location, piece by piece. Workers would lay the keel, build up the frames, add the hull plating, install the machinery, and work their way gradually from the bottom of the ship to the top and from the bow to the stern. It was a skilled, time-consuming, sequential process. A standard cargo ship might take a year to build. A destroyer might take 18 months. A battleship could take 2, 3, or even 4 years. Kaiser's insight was to attack this linearity. Instead of building one ship sequentially, why not build hundreds of subassemblies simultaneously in different locations, sometimes hundreds of miles from the shipyard itself, and then bring those pre-built sections to the ways and assemble them into a complete ship in a fraction of the traditional time? The hull section could be fabricated in one place, the engine room components in another, the superstructure in a third. Then everything comes together at the yard, and suddenly what took a year takes weeks. This was the method used to build the Liberty ships, the cargo vessels that carried the supplies, the ammunition, the tanks, the food, and the fuel that kept the Allied war effort alive. And the speed at which Liberty ships were produced was absolutely mind-bending. Kaiser's yards eventually launched new ships at a rate that defied belief. The record, set in September of 1942 as a deliberate publicity stunt, but using real workers and real methods, was the construction of a complete Liberty ship named the Robert E. Peary in 4 days, 15 hours, and 26 minutes. For days. From keel to launch. That record has never been broken. Now, Liberty ships were cargo vessels, not warships. But the techniques Kaiser pioneered, the modular construction, the parallel assembly, the massive workforce training programs, the round-the-clock operations, all of these found their way into naval construction as well. And combined with the traditional expertise of the established naval shipyards, they helped produce a rate of warship construction that has no parallel in history. Let's talk about destroyers, because destroyers are one of the great stories of the American naval buildup. Destroyers are the workhorses of any navy. Fast, multi-purpose vessels that escort convoys, hunt submarines, screen larger ships from torpedo attacks, and carry out offensive operations of their own. The United States needed them desperately. German U-boats were sinking Allied merchant ships faster than they could be replaced in early 1942, and the destroyer escorts needed to protect those convoys were in critically short supply. The solution was a production program of staggering scale. American shipyards began producing destroyers and destroyer escorts at a rate that would have seemed fantastical just 2 years earlier. The Bath Iron Works in Maine, one of the most efficient destroyer-building facilities in the world, could complete a destroyer in as little as 3 months, compared to the 12 to 18 months that had been standard before the war. Across the country, at yards in Seattle and San Francisco and Quincy and Orange, Texas, and Kearney, New Jersey, the steel was being cut and the keels were being laid and the destroyers were rolling down the ways in a continuous, unstoppable stream. By the end of the war, the United States had built 349 destroyers of the Fletcher class alone. The Fletcher-class destroyer is widely considered one of the finest destroyer designs of the entire war. Fast, well-armed, reliable, and versatile. 349 of them. One class of destroyer. And there were other classes too, the Gleaves class, the Benson class, the Sumner class, the Gearing class. The total number of destroyers and destroyer escorts built by the United States during the war exceeds 500 vessels. 500 destroyers. More than the entire active fleet of most major navies in the world today. But if destroyers were the workhorses of the American naval buildup, then aircraft carriers were its symbol, its icon, and in many ways its decisive weapon. And the story of American carrier production during the Second World War is perhaps the most extraordinary chapter in this entire extraordinary story. At the start of the war, the United States had 7 aircraft carriers: the Lexington, the Saratoga, the Ranger, the Yorktown, the Enterprise, the Wasp, and the Hornet. 7. Japan had 10 fleet carriers and 4 light carriers. Britain had 7. By the end of 1942, the situation for America had become genuinely dire. The Lexington was lost at the Battle of the Coral Sea. The Yorktown was sunk at Midway, though not before her air group helped destroy 4 Japanese fleet carriers in the most decisive naval battle of the Pacific War. The Wasp was torpedoed by a Japanese submarine in the Solomons. The Hornet was sunk at the Battle of Santa Cruz. By late 1942, in the entire Pacific Ocean, the United States had exactly 1 operational aircraft carrier. 1. The Enterprise, fighting alone against the full weight of Japanese naval air power. What happened next is the story of the Essex class. The Essex class aircraft carrier program is the production miracle at the heart of the American naval buildup. These were large fleet carriers, over 870 feet long, displacing nearly 30,000 tons, capable of carrying more than 90 aircraft, with a top speed of 33 knots and a crew of over 2,600 men. They were not simple ships. They were enormously complex, technically demanding machines of war, and the United States built 24 of them during the Second World War. 24. The first Essex-class carrier, the USS Essex herself, was laid down in April of 1941 before Pearl Harbor. She was commissioned in December of 1942, a construction time of just 20 months for a ship of immense complexity. Her sister ship, the Yorktown, named in honor of the original Yorktown lost at Midway, was laid down in December of 1941 and commissioned in April of 1943. 16 months. As the war progressed and the yards gained experience, the construction times got shorter and shorter. Some Essex-class carriers were completed in 14 months. The production system was eating itself alive with efficiency, and the Essex class was not the only carrier program. To fill the gap between the massive fleet carriers and nothing, the Navy converted a large number of light cruiser hulls into light carriers. The Independence class, 9 ships that went from cruiser keel to operational carrier in some cases in under a year. And then there were the escort carriers, smaller, slower, less capable, but produced in enormous numbers. The United States built over 100 escort carriers during the war. 100. These small carriers performed the endless, unglamorous, absolutely vital work of providing air cover for convoys, supporting amphibious landings, and hunting submarines. Without them, the war in both the Atlantic and the Pacific would have been immeasurably harder. By the final year of the war, the American carrier force was so overwhelming, so completely dominant, that Japan, which had started the war with the most powerful carrier force in the world, could barely put operational carriers to sea. At the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October of 1944, the Japanese used their remaining carriers as decoys, bait to draw the American fast carriers away from the invasion fleet, because they no longer had enough trained pilots to make their carriers effective fighting platforms. The American carrier force had not merely matched Japanese carrier power. It had crushed it so completely that Japan was using its carriers as distractions rather than weapons. Now I want to talk about submarines, because the submarine story is one that doesn't get nearly enough attention. While the surface fleet was growing at its astonishing rate, the United States submarine force was conducting a campaign against Japanese shipping that was, in its own way, every bit as decisive as the great carrier battles and the island-hopping campaigns. Japan was an island nation with almost no domestic oil, no domestic iron, or no domestic rubber. Everything that kept Japanese industry running, everything that kept Japanese armies fed and armed and mobile, had to come by sea. And the American submarine force set out to sever those sea lines of communication. The results were catastrophic for Japan and extraordinary by any measure of military effectiveness. American submarines sank over 1,300 Japanese merchant ships during the war, more than 5 million tons of shipping. They sank 1 Japanese battleship, 8 Japanese carriers, and over 200 other warships. They strangled the Japanese economy from the inside out. By 1945, Japan's industrial production had collapsed. Its oil imports had been cut by more than 90%. Its food situation was desperate. The island nation was being slowly but inexorably starved to death beneath the sea. And all of this was accomplished by a submarine force that had started the war with roughly 50 operational submarines and ended it with over 200. Boats that were longer, faster, more capable, more heavily armed, and guided by ever-improving radar and communications technology that the Japanese simply could not match. The Gato class, the Buildup class, the Tench class. These were formidable weapons, and American industry produced them in sufficient numbers and with sufficient quality to win a campaign that history has sometimes called the greatest submarine offensive of all time. But we've been talking about ships, and we need to pause and talk about what it took to build them. Because this is where the human story of the American naval buildup becomes truly profound. The ships didn't build themselves. Steel doesn't cut and weld and rivet itself. Every destroyer, every carrier, every submarine, every destroyer escort, every landing craft, every single one of those 6,800 vessels was built by human hands. And the story of those hands is as extraordinary as the story of the ships themselves. In 1940, the American shipbuilding workforce numbered roughly 170,000 people. By 1943, just 3 years later, it had grown to over 1.7 million. 1.7 million people working in American shipyards. 10 times the pre-war workforce in 3 years. And here is what makes that number even more remarkable. A huge proportion of those 1.7 million workers had never set foot in a shipyard before the war began. They were farmers from the South and Midwest. They were recent immigrants who barely spoke English. They were teenagers fresh out of high school. And most significantly, in a development that would permanently reshape American society, they were women. The story of women in American wartime industry is one of the most important and underappreciated stories of the 20th century. Before the war, women were almost entirely excluded from heavy industrial work. Shipyards, steel mills, aircraft factories, munitions plants. These were considered men's domains, and cultural norms, union rules, and employer practices kept them firmly closed to women workers. And then, almost overnight, all of that changed. With millions of men being drafted into the armed forces, American industry faced a simple choice: bring in women or stop building ships. An American industry, driven by the absolute imperative of wartime necessity, chose to bring in women. Rosie the Riveter, the famous propaganda icon created to recruit women workers, was not just a poster. She was a reality that lived and breathed and swung a rivet hammer in shipyards from Puget Sound to the Gulf Coast. Women learned to weld and rivet and operate overhead cranes and read technical blueprints and supervise assembly lines. They worked 12-hour shifts in the same heat and noise and danger as their male colleagues. And they were, by virtually every measurement, just as productive. In many cases, more productive. Women workers in American wartime industries consistently met or exceeded their male counterparts in quality of work, absenteeism rates, and safety records. The women who built the American war fleet were not filling in as a temporary measure. They were building the ships that won the war. Full stop. The training programs that brought these new workers into the shipyards were themselves marvels of organizational achievement. The federal government, working with the shipbuilding companies and with newly organized training schools, developed curricula that could take a person with no industrial experience and turn them into a competent welder or riveter in a matter of weeks. Not months, weeks. This was possible because of the same modular, specialized approach that drove prefabrication. Instead of training workers to do everything, you train them to do one thing, and you train them to do that one thing extremely well. The result was a workforce that was highly specialized, highly efficient, and could be scaled almost infinitely as long as there were people willing to learn. And people were willing to learn. The wages in wartime shipyards were extraordinary by the standards of the Depression era that had just ended. Workers who had been struggling to survive on farm wages or relief payments suddenly found themselves earning more money than they had ever seen in their lives. The economic incentive and the patriotic imperative worked together to create a workforce that was motivated, committed, and relentlessly productive. Let me give you another number that I want you to think about. In 1941, American shipyards produced a total of approximately 100,000 tons of naval vessels. In 1943, just 2 years after Pearl Harbor, that figure had grown to over 1.2 million tons. In 1944, it hit nearly 1.7 million tons. The rate of production was not just growing, it was accelerating. Every month, American shipyards got faster. Every month, the techniques improved, the workforce gained experience, the logistics chains tightened, and the output climbed. It was a self-reinforcing cycle of industrial achievement that nothing in history has matched. Now, I've been talking about ships, and ships are the center of this story. But it would be a serious mistake to talk about the American naval buildup without talking about the industrial ecosystem that made it possible. Because ships are not just steel and engines. They are radar and fire control systems and torpedo tubes and anti-aircraft guns and depth charge throwers and sonar equipment and miles of copper wiring and optical instruments and radio equipment and 1,000 other components that had to be designed, tested, manufactured, and delivered to the right shipyard at the right time in the right quantity. And behind all of that, behind every shipyard and every component factory, was the extraordinary American capacity to produce raw materials on a scale that the world had never seen. Steel. The war was built on steel. And American steel production during the Second World War was simply beyond comparison with any other nation on Earth. The United States produced more steel in 1943 than Germany, Japan, the Soviet Union, Britain, Italy, and France combined. The great steel cities of the industrial heartland, Pittsburgh, Cleveland, Gary, Indiana, were running their blast furnaces and open hearth furnaces around the clock, pouring out the metal that became the hulls and guns and armor of the American war machine. The ore came down from the mines of Minnesota's Iron Range on freighters that moved across the Great Lakes in an endless convoy, feeding furnaces that never went cold. Aluminum, too. The metal of the aircraft and of 1,000 shipboard fittings, poured out of smelters in the Pacific Northwest and along the Gulf Coast, powered by the electricity from the great hydroelectric dams that the New Deal had built in the 1930s. The Tennessee Valley Authority, the Bonneville Dam, the Grand Coulee Dam, all of those Depression-era public works projects suddenly revealed their strategic importance. The electricity they generated powered the aluminum smelters that produced the metal for the aircraft carriers that ruled the Pacific. History, it turns out, has a very long reach. And then there was oil, the fuel that drove the entire war machine, the bunker oil for the warships, the diesel for the submarines, the aviation gasoline for the carrier aircraft, the fuel for the tanks and trucks and jeeps of the ground forces. All of it came overwhelmingly from American oil fields. Texas, Oklahoma, California, Louisiana. The United States was the Saudi Arabia of the 1940s, the world's largest oil producer by an enormous margin. Without American oil, there was no Allied war effort. Period. The Soviet Union's tanks ran on American gasoline. Britain's ships burned American oil. The Pacific Fleet itself was powered by crude from Texas wells. The industrial superpower's most fundamental advantage was not its factories or its shipyards or even its workers. It was the raw material wealth of a continent so vast and so naturally endowed that it could feed and fuel and arm not just itself but half the world besides. This is the context in which the naval buildup happened. Not in isolation, not as a single industrial miracle, but as the most visible, most dramatic expression of an entire economy that had been reorganized from top to bottom for the single purpose of winning a war. The War Production Board, created in January of 1942, had the power to direct the entire American industrial economy, to tell factories what to make, to allocate raw materials, to set production priorities, to resolve conflicts between competing military programs. It was, in essence, a command economy operating inside a market economy, a hybrid that worked because the emergency was real, the stakes were existential, and the American business community, for all its libertarian instincts, understood that winning the war was the precondition for everything else. Automobile factories stopped making cars and started making tanks and aircraft engines and military trucks. Typewriter companies started making machine guns. A company that had been making pinball machines started making armor-piercing shells. The entire productive capacity of the American economy turned on a dime and pointed itself at the war. And that reorientation produced results that are still, 80 years later, almost impossible to fully comprehend. Let me give you one more example that I think perfectly captures the scale and the audacity of what happened. Landing craft. This is something most people never think about when they think about naval power, but landing craft, the small, shallow draft vessels that carried soldiers from ships to beaches in the great amphibious operations of the war, were absolutely critical to Allied strategy. Without landing craft, there was no invasion of North Africa, no Sicily, no Italy, no Normandy, no Leyte Gulf, no Iwo Jima, no Okinawa. The entire Allied offensive strategy was built on the ability to project military power from the sea onto enemy-held shores, and that ability lived or died on the availability of landing craft. In 1942, the Allied shortage of landing craft was so acute that it was derailing strategic planning at the highest levels. Churchill and Roosevelt argued bitterly over operations that could or could not be mounted based on the number of landing craft available. Eisenhower once said that the war was being fought by a shortage of landing craft. And then American industry solved the problem, the way American industry solved every problem during the war, by producing landing craft in numbers that made the shortage irrelevant. By the end of the war, the United States had produced over 60,000 landing craft of various types. 60,000. From the massive LSTs, landing ship tank, which could carry dozens of tanks directly onto a beach, to the small Higgins boats that carried infantry squads through the surf at Normandy and Tarawa and Peleliu. Andrew Higgins, The New Orleans boat builder who designed the landing craft that bore his name was called by Eisenhower himself the man who won the war. And the factories that built Higgins boats churned them out at a rate that was, by any measure, insane. Hundreds of boats per month, month after month, year after year, until the beaches of the world could be stormed whenever and wherever the Allies chose. 60,000 landing craft. Add them to the destroyers and the carriers and the submarines and the cruisers and the battleships, and you begin to approach that number, 6,800 commissioned naval vessels that I gave you at the beginning of this story. And now, having walked through the story of how they were built, the yards and the workers and the steel and the oil and the organizational genius and the sheer human will, that number doesn't seem quite so impossible. It seems, if not inevitable, then at least explicable. It seems like the product of a society that decided to do something and then actually did it. But I want to step back from the numbers for a moment, because there is a human cost to this story that the numbers don't capture, and that cost deserves to be honored. The ships were built, but the ships also fought. And fighting cost lives. The United States Navy lost 36,950 men killed during the Second World War. 36,950 human beings who went to sea and did not come home. They died in the burning oil of Pearl Harbor and the freezing waters of the North Atlantic. They died on the sun-blasted decks of destroyers during kamikaze attacks in the Pacific. They died in the crushing depths when their submarines failed to return from patrol. They died on the beaches at Tarawa and Iwo Jima and Normandy, carrying their rifles through the surf because someone had to. Behind each of those 36,950 names, there was a family. A mother who waited for letters. A wife who jumped when the telephone rang. A father who tried not to think too hard about where his son was. Children who grew up without ever really knowing their fathers. This is the true price of the 6,800 ships. This is what it actually cost. And every time we talk about the tonnage and the production rates and the industrial miracles, we need to hold in our minds simultaneously that this extraordinary machine of war was run by human beings at human cost, in a cause that demanded the ultimate sacrifice from tens of thousands of young Americans who had no other choice. Now let's talk about what all of this power actually achieved. Because the point of building 6,800 ships was not to build 6,800 ships. The point was to win a war. And in the Pacific, where the naval dimension of the conflict was most direct and most decisive, the story of how American naval power was used is every bit as extraordinary as the story of how it was built. In the first 6 months after Pearl Harbor, the situation in the Pacific was as dark as it could be. Japan had seized the Philippines, Guam, Wake Island, Malaya, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, Burma, and much of China's coastline. The Japanese perimeter stretched from the Aleutian Islands in the north to the borders of India in the west. Japanese naval power was dominant across an ocean that spans nearly a third of the Earth's surface. And the United States was reeling, still absorbing the shock of Pearl Harbor, still mobilizing its industry, still training its men, still building the ships and planes and weapons it would need to fight back. And then came Midway, June 4th through 7th, 1942. 6 months after Pearl Harbor, in the waters northwest of the Hawaiian island of Midway Atoll, the United States Navy inflicted on the Imperial Japanese Navy one of the most decisive defeats in the history of naval warfare. 4 Japanese fleet carriers, the Akagi, the Kaga, the Soryu, and the Hiryu, were sunk in the space of a single day. The planes, the pilots, the trained mechanics, the experienced officers, all lost. Japan had started the war with 6 fleet carriers in the Kido Butai, the fast carrier striking force that had attacked Pearl Harbor. In 6 minutes of dive bombing on the morning of June 4th, 4 of them were gone. The United States lost the Yorktown at Midway. 1 carrier, 4-1. And more than the ratio, what mattered was the irreplaceability of what Japan had lost. Japan could not replace those 4 carriers quickly. It did not have the industrial capacity. It did not have the trained pilots. Pilot training in the Japanese Naval Air Force took years, and the experienced aviators lost at Midway and Coral Sea and in the grinding attritional battles over Guadalcanal in late 1942 could not be replaced. The pool of experienced Japanese naval aviators was finite, and it was draining away battle by battle, while American training programs were producing hundreds of new naval aviators every month. This is the point where the industrial story and the military story converge. Japan fought brilliantly, courageously, and with tremendous tactical skill throughout the war. But Japan was fighting a war of limited resources against an opponent with effectively unlimited resources. And limited resources, no matter how skillfully husbanded, eventually run out. By 1944, when the new Essex-class carriers began arriving in the Pacific in force, the disproportion had become so overwhelming that the outcome was no longer in question. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June of 1944, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, as American aviators called it, saw the Japanese attempt a massive carrier airstrike against the American Fifth Fleet. They launched their aircraft in waves, and American combat air patrols, guided by radar, met them and destroyed them in catastrophic numbers. The Japanese lost over 600 aircraft in 2 days. The Americans lost 130. The Japanese carrier air arm, already weakened by years of attrition, was effectively destroyed as a fighting force. Japan would never again be able to mount a carrier air offensive. And in October of 1944, at Leyte Gulf, the Japanese threw their remaining fleet units into one last desperate attempt to destroy the American invasion force in the Philippines. The result was the largest naval battle in history, for separate engagements spread across hundreds of miles of sea, involving hundreds of ships and thousands of aircraft. And the result was total American victory. Japan lost 3 battleships, 4 carriers, 10 cruisers, and 11 destroyers. The Imperial Japanese Navy, for all practical purposes, ceased to exist as a fighting force after Leyte Gulf. What remained was used for kamikaze attacks, suicide missions that reflected the desperation of a nation that knew it was losing and had no other way to fight back. The kamikaze campaign was terrifying and costly. Suicide aircraft damaged or sank dozens of American ships and killed thousands of American sailors. The bravery of the young Japanese pilots who flew those missions, whatever one thinks of the strategy that sent them, was absolute and beyond question. But kamikazes could not sink Essex-class carriers. The armored flight decks, the redundant damage control systems, the sheer size and structural strength of these ships, and crucially, the ability to replace any ship that was badly damaged with another one rolling off the American production lines, meant that kamikazes, however costly, could not change the strategic equation. By the spring of 1945, American naval power in the Pacific was so overwhelming that the debate was no longer about whether Japan could be defeated but about how. The choices were blockade and aerial bombardment, which were already destroying Japanese cities at a horrifying rate. Invasion, which military planners estimated would cost hundreds of thousands of American casualties and perhaps millions of Japanese lives. Or the atomic bomb. The atomic bomb ended the debate, ended the war, and created the world we live in today. But that bomb was delivered by a B-29 flying from a base in the Mariana Islands that had been seized by amphibious assault. An assault mounted from ships built in American yards by American workers who went to work before dawn and came home after dark and built the greatest navy in the history of the world. The formal surrender of Japan took place on September 2, 1945, aboard the USS Missouri, a brand-new Iowa-class battleship commissioned in June of 1944 and named for the home state of President Harry Truman. The Missouri represented everything that the American industrial buildup had achieved. She was a 57,000-ton instrument of national power, built in less than 2 years, armed with 9 16-inch guns capable of firing shells the size of small cars at targets 20 miles away, bristling with anti-aircraft weapons, and serving as the stage on which the Second World War in the Pacific came to its conclusion. And then, and this is the part of the story that I find almost as remarkable as the buildup itself, it stopped. Almost overnight, the machine that had built 6,800 ships wound down. Ships were decommissioned by the hundreds. Contracts were canceled. Shipyards that had employed hundreds of thousands of workers closed their gates. The women who had built the fleet went home or tried to go back to the jobs that the returning servicemen were now reclaiming. The War Production Board was dissolved. Price controls were lifted. The command economy was dismantled. America went back to being America. The speed of the demobilization was almost as astonishing as the mobilization had been. By 1947, the United States Navy had shrunk from 6,800 ships to fewer than 700. The surplus ships were sold to Allied navies. Anchored in long rows in protected bays, the mothball fleets, or simply scrapped for the steel that a rebuilding world needed. The Liberty ships and the landing craft and the destroyer escorts that had been built with such desperate urgency were declared surplus and disposed of in their hundreds. But something remained. The knowledge remained. The experience remained. The understanding that American industry, when fully engaged and fully motivated, could produce military power on a scale that no other nation on earth could match. That understanding became the bedrock of American strategic thinking for the next 70 years. It is the knowledge that lurks beneath the surface of every American foreign policy commitment, every defense treaty, every forward deployment. It is the industrial memory of the country that built 6,800 ships in 4 years. And it is not gone. It is sleeping. So let's sum up what we have covered, because this story deserves a moment of reflection before we part. On December 7, 1941, a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor dragged an unprepared America into the largest war in human history. The United States Navy, with 790 ships, faced opponents that were in many respects superior in the short term. More ships, more trained crews, more combat experience, and the momentum of offense. In response, the United States unleashed an industrial mobilization that has no parallel in recorded history. In 4 years, American shipyards built nearly 6,000 additional naval vessels of every type, from battleships and fleet carriers to destroyers, submarines, and tens of thousands of landing craft. They did it by revolutionizing manufacturing techniques, by mobilizing a workforce of over 1.7 million people, including hundreds of thousands of women who had never held a welding torch, by tapping the almost incomprehensible resource wealth of a continental nation, and by the sheer force of collective will. The result was not just a larger navy. It was the most powerful military force in the history of human civilization, a force so overwhelming that it could project power simultaneously across 2 oceans, on multiple fronts, against 2 major enemies, and win. And behind every ship, behind every production record, behind every welding seam and rivet hole and freshly painted hull number, was a human being. A worker who showed up before dawn. A sailor who went to sea knowing that the odds were not in their favor. A family that waited and prayed and received telegrams they never wanted to see. The numbers are extraordinary. The numbers are almost beyond comprehension. But numbers are only numbers. The real story, the true miracle, was the human one. The decision, made by millions of ordinary people, to do something extraordinary. To build something that had never been built. To win a war that had to be won. And to do it in 4 years. That is the American superpower. Not the flag. Not the speeches. Not the ideology. The superpower is the capacity, when the moment demands it, to do the impossible. To go from 790 ships to 6,800. To turn a sleeping industrial giant into the arsenal of democracy. To reach into the depths of human potential and pull out something that leaves the world gasping. That is the story of how the United States Navy went from 790 ships to 6,800 in 4 years. And it is, without any qualification, without any exaggeration, without any doubt, the greatest industrial buildup in the history of the world.